What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Debbie Royale YouTube channel. We are back with another top 25 breakdown. Today, we are going over the Wisconsin Badgers coming in and just the whole new era out there in Wisconsin now. So last year, when you're looking at them, they definitely didn't have the season that they thought they were going to have. So what we're going to do is we're going to be diving in and what does that team look like for 2023? Go into their depth chart. Go full break into the new offense that they're having there with Longo. Looking at the defensive side, they're using a defensive scheme that I'm interested to see how it's going to work in the Big Ten. And then we're just going to be diving into recruiting class, what we look at their schedule, a full preview for you guys here. So if you're a college football fan, a Wisconsin fan, a Debbie fan, or just all of the above, hang onto this video, hit that like and subscribe button while the intro is going, and we'll give you all that information on the other side. All right, so we're talking about Wisconsin here. They were 7-6 last year, so they did not obviously have the season that you liked. Honestly, when we're thinking about Wisconsin overall, that Washington State loss 17-14 was really bad. That was probably like the signs that the Paul Chryst era was over. So that after he went 2-3, they got rid of Paul Chryst. They brought in Jim Leonard, and everybody kind of felt like Jim Leonard was going to be that heir apparent. Jim Leonard went 4-3. You know, that loss to Minnesota didn't help at the end of the year. And then they got rid of him. And they got Luke Fickell coming in from Cincinnati, former Ohio State interim coach there. Luke is, he took Cincinnati to a playoff. So he's definitely been in that area of like someone that's been, consistently good in college football. He coached the bowl game. It was a weird bowl game, but he's 1-0, baby. He got that win in there. And then he's bringing in some interesting pieces on that coaching staff. So when we're looking at that Wisconsin as a whole and their offense, they got Phil Longo coming over. He's coming to Madison after 3 seasons at North Carolina, and you saw an up-tempo passing offense. And so we've talked about, and we kind of dived into Washington in our last video, like how their offense was like 114th in the country. Then they get that kind of offensive-minded guys. They're going to throw it and chuck it a little bit. Maybe Wisconsin can have that same kind of area where, if Wisconsin fans, you guys are watching some interesting dynamic offense this year, unlike you've seen with Paul Chryst, kind of that ground and pound, which was successful, but trying to get in this new era of the playoff with the 12 teams coming after this next year, it'll be interesting to see. So why don't you give us a rundown of their offense, Christian, and maybe Longo, and overall what we think of this?
Yeah, first, before we get into the offensive line, I think there's certainly some questions on how much of this offense will be Longo's and how much of it will Fickell want to bring over from Cincinnati. Because when you watch the Cincinnati offense over the past few years, it had kind of mirrored that Paul Chryst offense where you try to run the ball first. When that doesn't work, they had a quarterback in Cincinnati that could kind of get them out of things for the most part with Desmond Ridder. So, I mean, he's a starter in the NFL right now. So I think when you look at what this offense is going to be, Phil Longo does a good job. There are some simplistic things within his offense, but they worked in the ACC. Is it going to work in the Big Ten? I'm not 100% certain, but we'll get into all that. Let's get into their offensive line. So they returned 60% of their starters, but Riley Mahlman played over 300 snaps last year. So really, they returned almost their entire offensive line. Wisconsin has been known as the offensive line place for a very long time. Almost 2 decades, I feel like. We've been talking about this as they breed tackles. We saw them have a very, very talented center prospect last year, which we'll get into here shortly. But this group, you have to like what you see. They weren't perfect last year. I think they were kind of growing into those roles.
Yeah.
But I do think that when you look at what this offense is going to do, in theory, I think they are more suited for that. So have to be excited about that. And then when you look at the rest of the offense, I think you have to be fairly excited for what this is compared to what last year was with Graham Mertz. So the main piece here, Tanner Mordecai coming over. If you guys want to join the Patreon, you'll get the College Football Manifesto. You'll get to see what we talked about on the quarterback room here. Tanner Mordecai is their quarterback. He came in. He's had a lot of success, threw for a lot of yards last year, over 3,500. And I think you're looking at a guy that he fits exactly what Longo has done in the past. So that's why you kind of hope that Fickell gives him the reins and says, all right, go run the offense. But they've got a ton of returning pieces. Braylon Allen is a hot name, of course. Chimere DK is a guy that a lot of people are excited for. I think he's a good player. And then they brought in some transfers that I think are going to be impact players as well. So, Kevin, what are you thinking about this Wisconsin offense this year?
Well, I think it was huge they got Tanner. So they got Tanner coming over from SMU. That was big. He's got 1 year remaining. And so, it's this year. And they've talked about it in camp. He's talked about it. I think he was quoted as like championship or bust in terms of that. So, Mordecai's coming in with that. He fits Longo's offense. When you're looking at what Longo's going to try to do, I think Mordecai fits that. 7,000 yards, 72 touchdowns in his career at just 2 seasons. When you're looking at what he did at SMU, I mean, those are gaudy numbers that he threw up there. And in 2021, he almost threw for 40 touchdowns. So like, this gives that offense something else. Now, he did not look good in the spring game. He saw a lot of interceptions. Weather wasn't that great. Coming into this, Longo's offense is not one that's easy to run either. I think it's going to be something that they're definitely going to have to develop, and I'm sure they're getting over it over the summer. But yeah, I think getting Mordecai was huge, right? And I think the biggest impact of this offense is going to is we're going to see Braylon Allen have not 8 to 9 man boxes. We're going to see Braylon Allen actually have an open, maybe running rooms to kind of get through. And so if you're looking for that bounce back, we'll get into Braylon in a little bit. He didn't have necessarily the greatest year last year. That's going to help him because when you're looking at it, overall, this offense is going to have less guys in the box. They got to be able to, they're going to have 4 wide receiver sets. You're going to have Mordecai out there just slinging it. So this does help out that offensive room, and that running back room to me, in my opinion. And I think Longo brings him something too, like that NFL pedigree. He could talk about, hey, he had May, he had Sam Howell, and even though Howell didn't get drafted where most thought he did, he's still going to be maybe a starter in the NFL this year, right? When we're looking at the Commanders, he developed DK Metcalf, AJ Brown. That's something to think about from that wide receiver perspective. Maybe a reason why CJ Williams shows up, Javonte Williams, and so he has that NFL like offensive. Hey, I've developed these guys. I have those. So that's something new at Wisconsin, in my opinion. Like we haven't seen that. Like we've seen Wisconsin be a Big Ten championship contenders. We've seen that. But you bring in a guy like this because you're trying to go to the playoff. Like that's your goal. Like I think that's really what Wisconsin needs to try to get to. So overall, yeah, absolutely think that was a good hire because that's what they needed. They needed that kind of that offensive minded guy in there. And I will say, like when we talk about losses, they didn't really lose too much at the skill positions. And they actually brought more in there. I will say Joe Tippmann's probably the biggest loss in terms of this offensive line. He's a stud. He was an absolute stud. I wanted the Cowboys to draft him. Tyler Beach and then Logan Brown, he was a 5-star kid, didn't necessarily like step up. Like he was in and out, but he did start. I think he was in 5 games last year at that right tackle spot. Then he got kicked off the team for an altercation and then he transferred to Kansas. So I think that when we talked about the offensive line, yeah, they did a good job in the transfer portal, kind of getting plugging some holes there. If Logan would have stayed and maybe they could have figured that out, maybe that consistency that he figured it out this last year, I think that would have helped them, but they did at least shore it up in the transfer.
Yeah, pretty big get for Kansas, although, you hope he has his head on straight out there, but Joe Tippmann is the big one, right? I mean, he was the anchor for everything that they did last year in pass pro and in their rushing attack. So I think the good thing is I think that Jake Renfro can kind of step up and maybe he won't be as effective as Tippmann was, but I do think that they've got a nice little plug-in for him as well.
Yeah. And when you look at the recruits, I think the one thing to say about this class, 58 overall in composite is not amazing. But first year coaches coming in, there's always going to be that kind of lackluster first class. And when you're looking at it, I think what they did is they filled in the gaps on the transfer portal. So we'll dive into that. Overall, like on the offensive side here, these are the offensive recruits they're bringing in. James Durant's probably the big one in terms of what he is, 6'4", 280. And again, Wisconsin's going to get big guys. They're going to come in and get that offensive line shirt up. I know the coaching staff has talked about Cole LaCrue from Colorado out there. He's 3-star kid. I don't, when they brought in all those transfer quarterbacks, I think Cole is just that depth piece of what they have there. Nothing too much stands out to me about anybody at the offensive side over here. It's just kind of like, hey, we got these guys, we're going to sign them, and then let's go get some transfers. I think that's what I feel like on this one.
Yeah, it's always a gap year with first-year head coaches, especially when this hire took place. I think Fickell gets on sometime last fall, but I think it was pretty close to signing day. I can't remember when Fickell officially
it was around
got
that
hired.
time.
Yeah. So I mean, they didn't have enough time to go out and kind of make their claim for some of these guys. So overall, I think you're right in that they hit the transfer portal hard, and I think that kind of makes up for that for at least this year. Like you said, key transfers: Mordecai, of course, CJ Williams, Bryson Green, Nick Evers, Jake Renfro, a guy that I like, and then Joe Huber as well. CJ Williams is one that stands out here to me. Just a guy that kind of got left out of
Yeah.
that USC wide receiver room. And I think, when you looked at his high school film, I thought he was pretty good. He hasn't really seen much time. I think he's going to be a pretty key piece for them this year, right?
I like him. I've liked him since he was in high school out here in California. 4-star kid. He's I think he needed time to develop a little bit, work on his hands. You saw a drop in the spring game too. You saw that a little bit. But if they're looking to open it up there, they need a wide receiver one, and I think that he can become that guy. Like I don't know what this wide receiver room too much is going to look like in terms of like they'll probably spread it around a lot. I know they like DK, they like those other guys. But CJ to me is that star, that kid that can go up there. He's talented. He's going to fit in Phil Longo's system too. Like I really like him in this system there. And it would not shock me in the middle of the year to be like, oh wow, CJ Williams, yeah, he's the dude. He's going to be their guy. He's going to be their guy moving forward. Also the other kid that I did want to mention as well. Nick Evers was a pretty highly touted recruit coming into Oklahoma last year. And obviously that didn't work out and he transferred out. They have talked about Nick as being a guy that needed to develop. And I think last year they talked about him definitely needed to develop in that system. And then that's why he didn't get a ton of playing time there. He is a very good dual threat kid. I think he's got a good, strong arm. The biggest thing with him is that he's got to grasp that offense. And I think that's going to take him a year. And that's why it's good to have Tanner in there. And then if he can take over, but they talked about him being the fifth quarterback in terms of the spring. That's not a good sign if you're thinking like, hey, moving forward there. But yeah, Renfro, Huber, they did a good job of getting these guys in there. Bryson Green from Oklahoma State, people liked him. He's got 2 years of eligibility left. Like those are really good gets.
Yeah, for sure. And I think they'll hit the portal less next year because I think they will focus on recruiting, and I think that they will have a nice chip in recruiting after this season. But in terms of impact players for this team, we've hammered at home for Mordecai. He's got to be good for this team to be good. I think that's with Graham Mertz, there were signs of like there was a good quarterback somewhere in Graham Mertz, and it showed up every once in a while, but he just failed to get the job done. And I think part of that was the staleness of that Paul Chryst offense, and part of that was just on him. But the other guys, Braylon Allen, Ches Malusi, those are guys, returning guys that what you're getting out of them. But like you said, I think there's going to be more opportunity for them to run against light boxes, which for Braylon Allen could be massive. I mean, that could push him into top 50 range in the draft, and that's going to push Wisconsin's offense to near the top of the Big Ten. And then Chimere Dike, to me, is going to be their definite wide receiver one. I think Mordecai is going to continue to look at him. I'm not sure what his NFL prospects are, to be honest, but I think he's a good player that can be super impactful for them. I think he's got enough experience now that he's going to be one of those guys that they defenses game plan around.
Yeah, and we didn't put him on here either, but I give him a shout. Skyler Bell is someone who I think is like that interesting piece. Could be that home run guy in that offense. Was the second leading receiver last year, 30 passes, 5 touchdowns. Kind of that kid that you could see definitely kind of step in there in that slot area. I know Will Pauling is there as well, but that's another guy in that impact area there. All right, let's go over to the defensive side of the ball. So new defensive coordinator, bringing in an interesting system. So when you're thinking of like their defensive, kind of like a 3-3-5 hybrid type area. I know it scores a lot of points. I know it gets a lot of turnovers. What are we doing with this new defense? Are we okay with this in the Big Ten? What's going to happen here?
It's a little worrisome, right? Because 3-3-5 isn't something that you traditionally want to run against the Michigans and Michigan States of the world, and Penn States even. But I do think that they have the talent. They have a ton of returning guys. I think, Muma Jungmeta is one of those guys that I think he's good enough in the middle of that defense to kind of hold it down and act like two linebackers. He's one of the best returning linebackers in the country right now. So I think they've got to be pretty excited about that. And when you look at the middle linebacker role in that Cincinnati defense over the last few years, there have been some dudes. Like there are a ton of dudes that are in the NFL. So I think when you look at how successful that Cincinnati scheme was and what they were able to do, I mean, they got to the college football playoff based on that defense. Now, do I think that there's a Sauce Gardner on this team? Maybe not right now. But I do think that they've got some guys that can piece together a probably overachieving defense compared to what the perception is right now.
Yeah, and Mike Tressel is their defensive coordinator. And when you're looking at him, I mean, he won the assistant coach of the year in 2021. That defense was fifth best in scoring, 10th in total defense, and best overall in pass defense. Now they had Sauce, they had those guys, but development wise in that secondary, you saw what Ohio State did to that secondary last year, and they just ran all over them. Like that's that area there. And I would say like it's 3-3-5, but it's not necessarily always a 3-3-5. You see that 3-4, you'll see them kind of use different areas in there. I just get flashbacks of Rich Rod and 3-3-5 and my Michigan Wolverine. So it's just I just get those nasty flashbacks a little bit. Notable losses. I think the big one that people were surprised on, Nick Herbert going to the NFL draft. That kind of like, oh, what happened here became like a key position to the field. Keanu Benton as well there, and then Samir Melvin. I think those guys were your notable losses. The biggest ones that linebacker area. I will say, like they got. I don't want to say they got lucky, but Jordan Turner had been suspended indefinitely for violating student athlete discipline policy, but they reinstated him recently. So having him back, I think is a good thing because, hey, he was all Big Ten, was the defensive MVP of the guaranteed rate bowl, 65 tackles. So that'll sure up that Herbert side. But yeah, losing a linebacker of his caliber and then Keanu Benton as well. Like those are your notable losses on this defensive side.
Yeah, Benton was a good player. I think he was probably undervalued by NFL teams, and he went pretty high in the draft. But that was kind of your anchor for that defense. But once again, there are some things, with this coaching change that you kind of throw away some of last year because this is going to be different. They stress different traits and things like that within this defense. So I think they have the pieces to be a much improved unit this year.
Yeah, 100%. On the recruiting trail, and you could tell they targeted that defense. I think, when you looked at the transfer portal on the offensive side, I think that's where they really got some guys. And in the defensive side, Braden Moore, he came in as an athlete, but it looks like he's going to be playing safety, 6'1", 190, however that looks. But again, with Tressel's background of what he's been able to do with that, with the defensive secondary back there, that's a good get. Like, hey, you're going to develop him. Jonas Tecluna as well, Jace Arnold. So you're looking here, they went after some guys. You're going to see like that secondary. You see it on the four corners and a safety. They definitely targeted that. Justin Taylor is interesting to me. They talked about him. He's an athlete. I don't know where he's going, but they've talked about they really liked him, and they like his perspective, his ceiling in there. But yeah, you see where they're going that secondary route, and that's really what they're going to be focusing on. And so again, right now, like I told you, their composite's not great, but in 2024, their composite's 19 already. So you can already tell Fickle's in there. He's recruiting his butt off. So if they see some success on this side, they're going to see that number go up.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you look at some of those guys, Amari Snowden, even 6'3", 187. When you think about what that Cincinnati defense was, there were a couple long arm guys and a couple like short, fast, twitchy guys as DBs. And I think, attacking both of those areas is key. And I think they kind of did that. Some of those other corners, obviously, kids have room to grow. These kids could be 6'2", 200 here shortly. But yeah, I like what they did on this side of the ball in terms of the recruiting trail. And I think the offense catches up next year.
Yeah. And then key transfers here, Nazir Forkarine, I think. Don't yell at me out there, YouTube comments. Cornerback here, going to Wisconsin. I think there's a big get, 3-star corner. Edge, Jeff, Petrowski, coming from Michigan State. When you think of him, didn't necessarily he wasn't an impact guy, but they talked about him being able to rush the passer as well. They like him in that edge role. Darian Varner is the guy that I kind of highlighted as I kind of went through this list of guys that they really like. Coming from Temple, big kid, came in as like a pretty solid prospect on that recruiting trail. And then safety Jason Maitre from Boston College. They like him as well. Kind of that 5'10", 188 big kid there. I thought they filled holes, depth. Really, that's what it is. I mean, I would expect this team to kind of definitely, you're going to see a lot of subs. You're going to see a lot of guys using this defense, pushing them in there and trying to find their guys. I think that's why they brought in the guys that they bring in.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in a second, but Maitre is a key piece to them. I think he's going to be that, box safety, slot corner. I think he's going to have a lot of roles for this defense. And I think, when you look at his experience and all the time he's played, I think that's probably one of their best gets in terms of the transfer portal here. But it's interesting to see, they added a few pieces. I think they definitely they said, okay, we've got a shot to do well on the recruiting trail on one side of the ball, then we're going to hit the transfer portal on the other. I think that was very clearly they wanted to build that defense out with the young guys and then get some experience on offense. But yeah, I mean, overall, this group is fine. I think, like you said, they're gonna rotate guys, so they needed more pieces on that defense.
Yeah, yeah. All right, let's get into impact players. So we went over these guys. We're gonna be talking about them. Let Christian kind of grab one just to go with Amatria as well a little bit, just to talk about that a little bit more. Last year, Boston College, he started 11 of 12 games. Last season, recorded 42 tackles, 6 passes broken up, an interception. And they talked about him. He's the number one slot corner, that box guy in there already in spring, and they love him. Terrific addition. I think that's like their big get there. Who else on this list? I know you talked about. I'll let you say his name, but we have Jordan Turner as well. CJ Goats out there. Who else do you like?
Muma Jongmeta. I mean,
Yeah.
I already talked about him, but like one of the better overall linebackers in the country right now. 68 tackles last year, 14 hurries, 3 sacks. Like he was a very all around linebacker, and he was pretty good in coverage too. I'd say if there's one area for him to work on, it's that. He's very much so your traditional middle linebacker that can kind of stuff the run and also get to the quarterback. But overall, like great tackler, great foundation for the middle of that defense. And I think that if this defense is to take a step forward, it's going to be on the back of him improving in that coverage area, but just making sure that he shores up that middle of the field. So
Yeah.
I'm really excited to watch him this year.
Yeah, and I put CJ Gotts on here. I think he's going to get pushed by Petrowski, the transfer from Michigan State. But he is a graduate senior. He started all 13 games last year at outside linebacker. 62 tackles, 8 for loss, 2 sacks. Like he's a guy to me is like that glue guy that can just fit and play. And he's those like type of guys you need in the Big Ten. So that I think there's just a lot of good guys around there. I think they're very solid. Like when you're just looking at these guys, they're just very solid. Redshirt seniors all over the place, like veteran guys that stayed for Fickle. And I think that's important to note about that defense. Overall, here's their schedule. So their over under is 8.5, right? That's what we're sitting at.
Yep.
Yeah. So, off the front, like not a tough schedule early. Buffalo, they need to go to Washington State at Washington State there. That's kind of that revenge game. They're going to see how that goes. Georgia Southern, I think they scared UCLA last year, but you got to beat Georgia Southern if you're Wisconsin. At Purdue, again, Hudson Card, new coaching staff. How's that look? Rutgers, and then really Iowa. Iowa's that first game to me is like, oh, okay, now we're at Iowa here. Cade McNamara transferring from Michigan. How do we do that? And then on the flip end, you got Illinois, Ohio State, Indiana, Northwestern, Nebraska, Minnesota. I don't like, hey, you missed Michigan State, you missed, Michigan, you missed Penn State. Not a bad little schedule for Fickle here in this first year.
Yeah. I mean, the most ideal, I think, that you could come up with.
Uh-huh.
I do think that, man, that Rutgers game feels a bit like a look ahead. Rutgers is not a good football team, but they tend to play well in their division games. So, and I don't know, man, Iowa to me, if they take that step forward, that's one of those games that Wisconsin could drop. But when you're looking at the schedule overall, I think you're worried about the Ohio State game, and then you're like kind of worried about the Nebraska at the end of the year, because I'm curious to see what that Nebraska team looks like at the end of the year. Outside of that, Illinois maybe, but this is, I mean, we said 8.5. That, I mean,
Yeah.
over, right? Like I think they're winning at least 9 games. So
I think 9 games is the base, right? I think that's that, and I could see them getting into 10. Like Minnesota, yeah, at Minnesota is gonna be tough, but again, they want to win that game. They've lost 2 in a row. Wisconsin fans, Fickle, you got to win that game. You got to go beat Fleck, because Fleck's getting a little excited out there, thinking that he's gonna get that third game. And then yeah, Illinois probably gonna take a step back a little bit, right? Like I think if this offense hits 9-10 wins is easily attainable, right? Going back to that Big Ten championship, playing for a Big Ten championship against probably Michigan. Just shout that out. Or Ohio State or Penn State. But yeah, I think the over on that for me is the big one there. But overall, I think Wisconsin, like you're in it's new for you now. It's a new time. You have Fickle there, who I think is going to be an excellent coach. I think they're recruiting well, top 20 class in 2024. I think the key thing for them is developing that quarterback position. What is that quarterback position going to look like after Mordecai leaves this year? Will it be Evers? Will it be some of these other guys in that room that we didn't necessarily talk about? Braden Locke transfer, Miles Burkett's there, they're Cola Crew, like those guys, or will they maybe go out of the portal again and go try to find someone for Longo's offense? I think that could be a possibility as well. So anything else before we get out of here on Wisconsin?
no, good football team. Surprisingly good. When I saw them this low on the list, I said, yeah, that makes sense. Then I started looking at it more, and I think by the end of the season, we're going to be looking at a top 10 to 13 team, somewhere around there. So I think if you're a Badgers fan, you're pretty happy right now.
Yeah, and I think Fickle did a great job of building this team and building this coaching staff too. I thought he did a good job putting that together. And again, remember, Badger fans, after this year, top 12 make the playoff, right? So you realistically, Wisconsin can get in there. Like now we're talking about these outer schools, Penn State, Wisconsin, this Big Ten that have a shot to get in there. And if you just get in, anything can happen, unless you play TCU if you're Michigan. But anything can happen. And once you're in, you go. So you should be excited there. So we appreciate you guys. Hit that like and subscribe button. We're trying to give the most in-depth team breakdowns we can. I don't think anybody else is doing it like this. So, give us some love. Show us some love out there. Don't yell at us too much about the pronunciations. We're trying our best out here. We don't listen to the TV with sound on. I don't anymore. I can't do it unless it's Gus Johnson. Shout out, Gus. You're my guy. So, see you guys. We'll check you guys on the next one.